Just a couple of things before we get started. I want to thank Profoto Daily, Epson, Photo Shelter, and American Photography for always helping us out. Um, I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled to have Eric Meola present tonight, and he'll be talking about his book, Bending Light, The Moods of Color. And with that, Eric, it's all yours. Thank you again.
Okay. Well, first thing I will tell you is you can find the book on Amazon, but put my name in and then put in Bending Light because otherwise you're going to get a death lamp. Uh, just enter Eric Meola Bending Light. Um, you know, I want to talk a bit about how this book came about. And the way it came about was number one, I'm getting older and I was scanning a lot of my work and, I wanted to find some order to it. Um, we go through life taking hundreds, if not, tens of thousands of photographs. And they're of all sorts of different subjects. And most of us, including myself, uh, try to do it in some order that shows what we like to shoot and has some meaning to it. But the truth is that we're lucky if we make a few great photographs during our lifetime. So I guess I tasked myself with scanning, first of all, a lot of images and then trying to put them into some kind of categories and order and really a sensibility about what it was that I've been trying to say for the last 30, 40, 50 years. Um, and in some ways it was a lot easier and in some ways it was a lot tougher than I expected. Fortunately, I think I came out on the end that I wanted to come out on. But I want to give you a little background. I grew up in the glory days of the golden era of photography when people like Ernst Haas and Art Kane and Pete Turner and Avedon and Hero, um, Diane Arbus. You'd bump into them in the street. You'd bump into them at a meeting, and you'd schmooze with them. You'd hang out with them. You'd have drinks with them, and so you got to talk with them, firsthand and get a sense of what they were about, what their work was about, and there was a sense of camaraderie, which I think still exists, but not like it did back then. So it was a golden era, and it was the era of film. We've already forgotten that era pretty quickly. But I worked for Pete Turner for a year and a half, and he was a great teacher. He didn't teach in any direct manner. I'm not sure he realized he was teaching, but I think he did. He would come up with all sorts of things that he said that really meant a lot to us. And I'm not sure that he realized how much, like I said, I'm not sure he realized how much they meant. But he would say, um, you don't work for me, you work with me. And that was an important differentiation. And it meant a lot to us. So one of the things he did for me me in particular, was he introduced me to a lot of people that he worked for. Shortly before I left, and the reason I left was, he had said when I started working for him that after a year and a half, he felt that it would be time for me to leave. And in retrospect, I think that was the perfect time course, I was nervous and I had no sense whatsoever of how I was going to survive. But I didn't feel he was kicking me out on the streets. I just felt that he was, you know, he did not want to get used to the person who was working for him. I think that changed the older he got, but he wanted fresh blood in there, to do everything from critique him to have a different sensibility about how to run the studio.
So Eric, now you're 23
Yeah.
and you're out, right? And you're going to open up your own studio. What was how, what was the feeling like to do that? I mean, to have the courage to do that, like, or, go in and, work for somebody else. I mean, now you're doing it on your own. How was that for you?
um, Good and bad. I mean, it was good to finally get out there and say, I got to make something of this. I've got to take whatever I've learned, and I know I'm going to stumble and fall and make mistakes, but I also know that I'm going to learn a lot in the process. And if anyone is silly enough or stupid enough or whatever to hire me, I'm going to have to come up with the goods, and it's that moment of realization that you've got to come through.
Mm.
I'll talk about that a little as we get into
Yeah.
this, but let me show a few slides that are specifically about the book, and then I'll stop and you can ask some questions. So one of the first things that I did with the art director, Greg Wakabayashi, was to separate my work into different categories. So I came in with 400 or 500 selects, and we divided it into abstracts, architecture, as you can see, landscapes, miscellaneous, people, storms, wildlife. And then as we went back and looked at more material, new selects. And these are usually the overriding factors that you choose photographs, for. They're based on light and color. If there are people in the photographs, and even if there aren't people in the photographs, there's some kind of gesture going on in the image, which is always very important. And in my work, there's a lot of geometry, and we'll get into that a little later. One of the things that I wanted to do in this book, because it's always been obvious to me that having worked for Pete, that my main subject is color. I always look at the color that's in the photograph before I look at anything else. Obviously, I see what's going on in the photograph. Obviously, it's different if it's a landscape with a person in it, the still life. But I'm always trying to say something using the color. So I wanted in a sense, an unusual but a somewhat generic subject, which is simply reflections in water. So this is the opening photograph in the book. And I also wanted to talk about the history of color photography. I think most photographers don't know anything or very little about the history of color photography. So I had read a piece by a woman named Carol McCusker, and she was kind enough to let me reproduce it. So there's a lot of text that starts the book. I wanted to dwell a little bit on this photograph because it's something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. And I refer to it as the curse of Born to Run. I have only good things to say about the fact that I made this image, but the reality is that there's some give and take in my mind because people are always going to associate me with this image. I can think of a lot worse things for them to do, but the Born to Run photographs, obviously in black and white, and we shouldn't dwell on that too much, but I decided not to put any of these in the book, which is a retrospective, because they're black and white, and it's a book about color. But one of the things that was important about this series of images was the white space. And, I basically grew up in the era of advertising. And I always shot for myself. I did a lot of editorial work. I did a lot of work for myself. I would shoot for myself all the time. But the white space was important to an art director like John Berg, who was the art director on this series, because you could put type in there. It was also important to me because one of the tricks that Pete would say is he would always try to shoot horizontally as much as possible, because back in those days you were more likely to get a magazine spread, which took up 2 pages, which meant you were going to get paid more, as opposed to shooting vertically, which would only be a single page. But the white space was really important, especially, in terms of, I'm getting these chats coming up here, and especially in terms of the cover shot, because, they needed to credit everyone who was involved in the album. One of the fantastic things about shooting with Bruce is he was open to just about everything, and I talked him into going out to Nevada to photograph some photographs out in the desert. So this is a large print of this is hanging in his house, as well as a large print is hanging in my house. But an interesting story comes up now as we get into the color. A couple months after I photographed the cover, I was asked by an art director from Sweden named Bo Zonders to travel around the world photographing coffee plantations. And that was probably one of the first large jobs to come back to your question about, how you feel when you go out on your own. You start thinking in terms of concepts. For instance, coffee is a fruit. It's categorized as a fruit. It grows on these bushes, and the coffee bean is inside of the fruit. And up until I found this vantage point, to photograph all the trees, I had concentrated on doing close-ups of the hands with the fruit and people's faces, but I needed a photograph that told the story, all in one image. So I found this vantage point up on a hill, and then I found this guy named Antonio. So I'd like to read a little from the text that goes with this photograph that's in the book, and I'm going to shorten it because I've got a lot of photographs I want to talk about, and I don't want to just be reading all night long here. But so one day we came across Antonio, and after making dozens of shots as he picked the red berries off the trees, I asked if he would stand in the light just inside a small barn so I could make a few formal portraits of him. Shaking his head yes, he took his workman's red scarf, draped it around his neck, then lit a cigarette, folded his arms, and looked straight at the camera. In just a few seconds, he had made a remarkable transformation from a happy but tired and gritty laborer to a male model confronting the viewer straight on, ready for his moment in the light pouring in through the open door. In effect, um, he became a male model within seconds. Looking back at the photographs I made of him, I remember his wife and young son who also worked alongside him. As the smoke curled up from a cigarette, I was struck by his dignity. A few weeks earlier, I had photographed Bruce Springsteen and Clarence Clemens in my New York studio for the Born to Run album cover, and I used the same camera that I used to photograph Antonio. All through the trip, I had been wondering whether one of those photographs that I had taken would make the cover of the new album. So I saw the album cover before a lot of people did. John Berg had shown it to me, but 2 whole months went by before the album actually came out, and of course you're always worried, will something change? Will Bruce change his mind? Will John change his mind? So I lived through those 2 months, but luckily I had work to do. As I glanced back at Antonio that afternoon and shot my final frames of him, he broke into a grin. So, making photographs like this, in which I tried to show his dignity, and making photographs like this, where I had to find a vantage point and tell a story, we're all part of that process of growing up
Mm.
and seeing and learning and knowing that you had to tell a story. You had to tell a story with the photograph. You didn't just have to take the photograph they showed you in the layout. And very often I had noticed that Pete, for instance, would first cover what he was given. If it was a photograph of an elevator, he'd photograph the elevator. But then he'd photograph the people in the elevator, and he'd photograph the guy who operated the elevator, and he'd move back and he'd do a wide angle shot and a close-up shot. And that was part of his process that he was teaching us without realizing he was teaching us, because we would go through the edit with him, which was fantastic.
Mm.
And we would see how his mind worked, and the fact that he'd cover it and then he'd do all these shots around it. And one of the things that would happen is that all of a sudden, they thought they only wanted the shot of the elevator, but all of a sudden they made a whole campaign out of it. And the shot that you were getting, I don't know, $500, $1,000 for, turned into a $10,000 shoot. So that was how we learned. We learned by watching and observing.
So one thing, Eric. So I mean, Antonio and Bruce, they come into your space, and what is it about you that Antonio all of a sudden has this dignity, right? I mean, you can't really teach that. Like, what was that
He
relationship?
had never been photographed. I mean,
So what was it? What do you think?
you know, there's something that, I see people all the time who are afraid to photograph people,
Mm.
and they freeze and they, they get nervous about it, and all of a sudden the obvious thing of shooting a vertical or shooting a horizontal or coming in close or being a little wider, they just, they lose it. And if they would just be themselves and let it evolve, they're not really expecting anything, and you shouldn't be either. It will come together as you get used to it. I found, obviously, the more you shoot, the more relaxed you yourself become, the more you get a sense of how to communicate with the person. But there's another image that's coming up, and we'll talk about that a little more. But probably the best example I could give you was when I photographed Bruce. he said, well, where are we going to photograph? What are we going to photograph? How are we going to, he wanted Clarence in the photograph. And in those days, he realized that Clarence was a great person, great sax player, but they also worked off of each other on stage. They were beginning to work off each other on stage. And I said, well, we're going to shoot in the studio. And he said, why in the studio? And I said, well, because I know you're busy in your studio. I want a place where I can depend upon the light. I can choreograph the whole thing in terms of orchestrating the shoot and shooting a lot of stuff. Otherwise, we're running around looking for locations, and I already knew, Avedon was doing a lot of white background stuff, and that's partially where that came from. But I wanted control, and what happened was, I realized that Bruce and Clarence were in effect going to have to pose for a lot of these photographs. And, these guys, they don't pose. They're on stage and they rock and roll, and, they need music. And that was a big problem. So, I said that to Bruce. I said, look, I'm going to have music. We're going to play the music. But you're going to have to realize that I'm looking for certain poses, and not looking for certain poses. And I think, Bruce, when he did the thing on Broadway, and you see him in some videos, he talks about posing in front of a mirror. I mean, a lot of the things that you see him and whoever's in the band now, and back then Clarence, you realize that they stand in front of a mirror, just like an actor stands in front of a mirror and practices and practices and then makes it just happen. And you're totally, it's it becomes part of the repertoire of who they are and how they act. So I don't know what it was with Antonio, but I think a lot of it had to do with he had never been photographed before. And it was, his whole face lit up. And it was just all of a sudden, it was like, wait a second, this is not a Calvin Klein, ad, this is not Ralph Lauren, but I didn't say that, because he just made it happen. And I just went with the flow.
Yeah,
So,
beautiful.
anyways, the reason that the word words is up here is because I realized in going through all the scans that I wanted to talk about photography and what it was like to grow up with an Ernst Haas or a Pete Turner, and to work in the studio and to learn things from them. And so I wrote an essay myself. It's longer than this. It's several pages. But I wanted to describe what it was like, in those days, as I'm sure you remember, Frank. And just some of the things you learned and some of the fun of shooting in those days. But I also wanted to describe what was going on in each photograph. And I deliberately chose this one as one of the starting photographs, because it's the last photograph in the book. And I had to write a caption for it. And normally there wouldn't be a story behind this photograph other than how it was made. But here's the story I wrote. And this one I'll read the whole thing because I think it's important, but it's probably the only one I'll read the whole thing. In 1967, as some of my classmates at Syracuse University were drafted into the Vietnam War. So that was 67. That's me, refusing induction. Professor Fred Demarest at the Newhouse School of Journalism asked a young photographer from New York City to show his photographs and talk to the students. Fred was a closet visionary, for he chose the photographer whose work was, at that time, pushing the boundaries of color photography in a way that had nothing to do with journalism. I had long hair, very long hair, and I was falling in love with the mistress of color photography. When the first 35 millimeter chromes dropped into the projector's beam of light, I felt an electric current run up my spine. It would be another 3 years before Ernst Haas's book, The Creation, became a bestseller, but as slide after slide projected onto the screen, the room was hushed. Ernst had just returned from Yellowstone, where he did an essay for Look magazine, and as he talked, I heard the voice of a mystic, the voice of someone transfixed by color and who was redefining it, as well as photography. When I went to New York later that year and I visited him on 7th Avenue, he asked me if I painted. Now, you have to realize, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, you know. When I made the appointment with him, he said, come by at 6. I hung up the phone. And then I realized 6 p.m., 6 a.m., I had no idea. And this was like in the morning. And I didn't want to call him back. He said, come, I hung up the phone. And something told me he meant 6 in the morning. I showed up at 6 in the morning. As soon as I rang that buzzer, his voice came through loud and clear. I mean, he had been awake for an hour. So I'm expecting him to talk about photography, and here he is talking about painting, which, it's like, I don't paint. He asked me if I painted, and I said I didn't know how to paint. He responded that I didn't have to know how to paint to paint. And that thing really stuck with me, because that's what this photograph is about. A lot of my work now is very abstract. Obviously, I don't have to sell this to an ad agency, but it taught me a lesson about seeing. I was a slow learner, but he told me to open my eyes, see differently, dream, let my mind wander wherever it would take me, and remain at heart an amateur. He was telling me this, for amateurs are the ones with eyes wide open. We're taught to think linearly, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Nothing can be further from the truth. We find beauty in chaos and chaos in beauty. They're both there, if only we would look. The calligraphy of light and color is the language of all art. We're just temporary custodians of that dialect. There's some pretty fancy words in there, and I don't know how much of it pertains, but the reality is there were some great teachers then, just as there are great teachers now. And you could ring the bell and see these people at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was fantastic. It was
Do you think,
great time.
yeah, Eric, do you think of yourself as a teacher now?
I'm beginning to. I'm realizing how much we've all learned in this process of editing my own work and telling the stories and writing the stories. I realized all the thought I put into it, and how important it is to me needs to be reflected to the people that I'm trying to tell the stories to. So these are the standard, blow up contact sheets. We would make large prints and cut them up and, put them on the floor, and then shuffle them around. And the problem was that you wanted to find a flow. It wasn't just telling the stories. First of all, those categories that I showed earlier, abstracts and portraits and landscapes and still lifes. Well, the most important aspect of all of these pictures was that they had to tell a story. There had to be a story behind each and every one of them. So on this particular sheet, there is a story behind each and every one of these photographs, but this one up here, or do I choose this one up here? They're both, they're both from India. And I didn't want to have too many photographs from India. So that became, part of the process of editing these 450 photographs down to, a workable number. This was a series of photographs that I only chose a couple images. It was storms out on the Great Plains, and I had done a book on this, so I wanted to include a couple because it was a retrospective, but I didn't want to include more than two.
Wow.
Oops.
And the editing process for you, Eric, I mean, how is it painful? Is it easy? I mean, once you know what you want to do, how do you go through that?
You know, believe it or not, in about 1 hour, we edited the 400 or 500 images we started with. In 1 hour, we edited it down to 50 images, and we just went in, out, in, out. It was bloody. It was like
And
Greg and I were on the same wavelength. It's like quit the nonsense. Let's not struggle over this. And then we went back and we said, okay, we did this too quickly. Let's think about this a little more. And we started adding a few back in. But in all seriousness, we did set up some rules. And like I said, since I had recently done a book on storms, we only included a couple.
Mm.
And this was a photograph I threw in here because while I was photographing the storms out on the Great Plains, I also did a whole series on churches out on the Great Plains. And most of these photographs have never appeared anywhere. But we just didn't feel they were right for this book. This is also a series I did on Antarctica. There are a lot more images to this series, but we also felt we would include a couple, but not more than two. Actually, I'm sorry, there are three in the book from Antarctica.
And Eric, when you set, you go after putting the book together, how do you set these perimeters up for yourself? Like only two, only three, how
You
does that
know,
work?
it's a discussion between Greg and myself, and then we meet again, and we change our minds or don't change our minds, and we revisit those guidelines that we set for ourselves.
Yeah.
And then there are the images that are part of your career but make no sense. This was a Time magazine cover I did for Beverly Sills, the opera singer.
Yeah.
But it's an outlier. There's no reason to put it in the book. But one of the things that we decided early on is that each image had to tell a story. There had to be something behind the image that explained not just what it was you were looking at, but I wanted to reveal something about our thought process as to why we put it in the book. So I'm going to read a little from the text that's there. I won't read the whole thing. I'll skip, like I said, I'll skip some sentences here. But I'll just give you the outline. I went on my own as a freelance photographer in 1970, and the lonely search for work and recognition occupied every moment of my existence. This image of a lizard threading itself through a ring opened doors. So now in those two sentences, I told you the story. you know, I did this as a personal project to say, this is what I do, or one of the things that I do. And I wanted people to sort of not gasp, but like, how the hell did he do this? You know, like,
Yeah.
it was a tour de force of a setup shot on 8x10 with 4 feet of bellows on the camera to get the macro view of my 6-inch long subject. I was standing on top of a ladder, shooting straight down and could only see the lizard on the camera's ground glass. So that's part of that was part of, you know, telling this story, is telling the stories behind how these were created.
Yeah.
I had soon tracked down a Mrs. Gray at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. She assured me that the tremendous light of the strobe would not be seen or felt by the lizard. Don't ask me how she knew this. She was a delightful septuagenarian who kept a bottle of live giant Amazonian cockroaches on her desk and who handed me a tarantula as if she were tempting me with candy. I affixed the emerald and diamond ring to a sheet of shimmering green foil covered paper and spent several hours making tests. Anyways, you get the idea. You know, the idea was to tell the stories behind how these images were made.
Yeah. And Eric, how easy is it or difficult is it for you to become the teacher to your assistants?
Well, you know, one of the things that I learned from Pete, Pete Turner, you know, working with Pete. He was a great uh, teacher, a great mentor. He he would do things that were out of the ordinary, that he was uncomfortable with, and because he had a hunch, he had a sense that he could say something different with the image by trying something different. And you know, he did all sorts of photography from, you know, once he got into advertising, you know, he was primarily a travel photographer up to that time, but he used his desire to photograph things in different ways, to photograph still lifes, to do advertising, and that rubbed off, and that was something, you know, that rubbed off on me.
Mm.
And you know, in doing this, this is, by the way, Joanna's ring, her emerald and diamond ring, my wife.
There you go.
And I had bought it for her, you know, shortly before we made this image. But you know, you were teaching yourself as well as he was teaching us. Um, you know, you wanted to learn in the process of learning came alive again. You had left school, but you were back in school. You know, it was fantastic.
Yeah. Mm. And did Joanna get a stylist fee on that shot there, Eric?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Early in my career, an ad agency that represented medical and pharmaceutical clients contacted me to make a photograph that described acupuncture. As I walked into the agency, so you would get this very abstract concept thrown at you. I mean, the concept wasn't that abstract. It was, how do you visually describe acupuncture? And I guess the obvious thing that occurred to me was, you show the needle, which, you know, most people don't like needles. And how do you show it in a graphic way? So I went back to my studio. The ad agency you know, wanted this photograph that described acupuncture. And I was sitting there, and the elevator door opened up, and this Japanese model who was on a go seat with this incredibly long neck came into the studio, and immediately it all gelled. It was like, this is it, you know? So I had to talk her into, letting me uh, put a needle into her neck. So as I walked into the ad agency, I passed a magazine stand that had copies of Harper's Bazaar and Vogue on display, and I started thinking about the work of the photographers Hero and Irving Penn. I sat down at a table with a group of executives, and they explained what they wanted and what they didn't. The more they talked, the more they contradicted each other, and it soon became obvious they were concerned about showing the needle. I asked if I could have a few needle samples and told them I'd come back the next day with some ideas. Within minutes of getting back to my studio, the elevator doors opened and in walked a statuesque Japanese model with the longest neck I've ever seen. In every career, there are moments of serendipity. This was one of mine. She was on a go-see for another job that I had, but I called her agency and I quickly arranged to photograph her later that afternoon. Then I called a stylist to get a licensed acupuncturist, and by the day's end, I had photographed an acupuncture needle along the curve of her back and neck. The drama of this photograph came down to the light and to the contrast and visual surprise of the model's long, elegant neck with a sharp, thin needle embedded in it. The next afternoon, I presented my photographs to the ad agency, knowing they were only expecting ideas. They loved the concept and the photographs, and they hired me to shoot the rest of their campaign. I'm sure it wasn't what they had in mind, but that's what made the photograph. It was totally unexpected. So in the book, each page has this text opposite the photograph that explains the story behind making the photograph. And this was one of those moments that just happened because she was coming to the studio for just a go-see, and she was perfect. The idea of the needle in her neck, it was like, that's it, boom. So, these things happen to everyone, and they don't happen to everyone, but this was one of my lucky days, so to speak. Now, I put these in this order because this is where someone like a John Berg or a Greg Wakabayashi, art directors, a John Berg or a Greg Wakabayashi sees things that you don't see. Or I don't mean you specifically, I mean me, in terms of, it would never occur to me to put a dinosaur after this Japanese model. But Greg saw it immediately. It was the long neck of the model and the long neck of the dinosaur. And we wanted contrast. We didn't want it to just flow. At certain points, the music flows, but then you want to have jarring music. You want to have a John Cage sound. You want the hair to stand up on the back of your neck. Why is the dinosaur come after the model? And that's, like I said, that's where a John Berg or a Greg Wakabayashi comes in. So I went to Iceland for the first time, and I went up in a helicopter, and I'll read the story behind this one. I had a choice: $1,600 an hour for a helicopter, or a lot less for a plane. I wanted to drift, to look out at the sea of brilliant hues below, the outwashed plain of glaciers, rich in minerals, the moraines of pulverized rock and debris, the meltwater sediment flowing in brushstrokes in the North Atlantic. I chose the plane and the slow drifting dream time of letting my mind wander with the wind. No sooner had I strapped in when Omar, my 80-year-old pilot, accelerated across bumps in the farm field and opened up the throttle of the Cessna. I made a mental note to have an oral surgeon relocate my lower jaw, just as low-hanging telephone wires leapt into view at the end of the field. Omar turned his deeply lined face toward me for a second and yelled, "Don't worry, we pass under the wires." And with those words lingering in my mind, he deftly passed the wings a few inches under the wires between the poles, and we began to climb straight up into the clear Icelandic air. Below us, the abstract patterns of white, mauve, and cerulean blue were a two-dimensional textured canvas of soft waves. As the Icelandic spar, rhyolite, olivine, obsidian, and magnetite mixed with volcanic ash and refracted color on their way to the beach. I had begun to dream when suddenly the plane was buffeted from the upper winds. Shooting frame after frame, I could see specks of white moving across the seascape, but they were far, far below. Arctic terns, no doubt, teasing me as they flew out of sight to the edge of the glacial melt. I asked Omar to go lower, and he obliged by shoving the stick forward, plummeting the plane several hundred feet down in a few seconds. More terns flitted across our view as my camera's eyepiece slammed against my glasses. I nudged Omar and signaled for him to rotate the plane on its side, and just as he did, the birds migrated into my frame, glistening in the sun. Perhaps it was a mirage, for just as suddenly as they arrived, they were gone. So, this is what it's like to be a photographer. You know, you come up with these ideas and you go for it. And you know, I guess I guess a lot rubs off with art directors as well in terms of where these thoughts come. It's hard to explain the synthesis of the idea that you get for taking a photograph, just as it is for an art director to say, aha, you know, I'm going to put this over here instead of over here. And I've always been fascinated by that. And I think that's part of what gels between art directors and photographers, or art directors and artists, is it's not that they see on the same level, but they bounce off of each other. And you know, when that kind of synthesis happens, it's really fantastic.
Mhm.
So I've mixed my papers up, and I'm not sure if I'm going to read about this one. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm gonna read about this one, but oh,
Mm.
yeah, no, I've mixed up my papers, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
We can, yeah, we'll talk about this one.
Perfect.
In 2007, I photographed Holi, the festival of colors in India. Losing a couple of lenses to the ravages of gritty colored powder that insinuated itself into every gasket, every seal, and every place that it could, wreaking havoc with my equipment. But I managed to survive and make some of my best images through sheer determination and perseverance. It's a time of great joy in India, as it marks the celebration of Krishna's birth. And with the arrival of spring, the streets are filled with masses of people throwing color on everyone and everything. When I arrived at Mathura in the early afternoon and scouted a rooftop perch, I was the only person there, but as the hours passed, more and more people crowded in nearby, and a few climbed into the overhang with me. As the empty spots dwindled around me, I got high on the sheer terror and adrenaline pumping through me. And at a certain point, most photographers weigh disaster against getting the picture. And that was all I could think of getting the picture. So I'm going to shorten this a bit. As the chanting, noise, and color shocked my body into submission, I wondered if I was going to wake up from a dream that bordered on a nightmare. Finally, after several tons of color had been hurled, the unimaginable happened. Everyone ran out of ammo. I scrambled back onto the rooftop and looked down at my arms and hands and legs and realized I'd have to throw everything away that I was wearing. One of the men standing next to me began to laugh. And when I realized he was laughing at me, I burst out in laughter too. Everyone was laughing. We had survived. Later that evening, as I lay back on my hotel bed, dazed with exhaustion, I grinned. It had been a long, crazy day, but I was elated because India held me in its spell. So I was, I was standing in a bookstore, and the idea of going to India and doing a book on India had always been in my mind. Um, for the longest time, I have notes and people I was corresponding with back 20 years before I finally went to India. And, it was just something I had to do. And I kept putting it off. And finally, I said, the only way I'm going to do this, because I wanted to do something. I knew in my mind that I wanted to go for months at a time. And this was a time when I had reps, Maureen Martell and Bill Stockland, and they were fantastic, just as just as you are, Frank. But I you know there was no assignment. I wanted to go for maybe 6 months, maybe even a year.
Wow.
And I was going to have to basically tell them that I was leaving and quitting and whatever, and I had no idea how to get an assignment to shoot for a year, let alone 6 months. And I went to the Indian Tourist Board. I walked to the Indian Tourist Board, and I started talking with them, and they said, well, and I guess, looking back on it, they were looking for someone to go and just shoot some advertising photographs, but and editorial photographs, but they didn't have in mind sending someone for that period of time. So I walked out of the office that day, and they had agreed to sending me to India. Little did I know that I was only supposed to go to India for 7 days. So, it was this, they never explained that to me. And I don't know if they were deliberately holding that back or what. But I went home and I started doing research I got every book I could get on India. And I pulled out all this stuff on things I wanted to photograph. And I came back and I presented it to them, and I said, I have to go for 165 days. And they normally send someone for maybe 7 days if you're with the press. And they looked at me like, uh-huh. And we kept talking. And, they said, well, we'll book all the flights and we'll get it all arranged. Don't worry, you'll leave at Christmas time. And you'll go for all of, I think it was 2007, 2008. And the time came for me to leave and no tickets arrived. And I realized that the person who was in charge had, spoken, he had deep pockets, but not that deep. And he was gonna pull the rug out from underneath me. And I kept calling him up and he kept avoiding me, but finally he sent me, and he found a travel agency there that turned out to be quite fantastic. And I made 2 trips to India. Well, I'd gone on my own actually for 3 weeks back in 1998, but I went for almost 7 months to India,
Wow.
and I did a 4 month trip the first time, that I did a 3 month trip, and I had access to planes, trains, and automobiles, as they say, and it was just incredible.
Wow.
Uh, okay. So I'll read a little about this photograph. In the small town of Ouarzazate on the edge of the desert in southern Morocco, Joanna stayed behind to photograph while I went out to the dunes. I had left our guide with her while I looked for a high vantage point from where I could photograph an overview. And I walked about a quarter of a mile out into the dunes, and I came across a Berber woman sitting alone, her hands folded on her lap. I knew she could see me through her jalaba, but I had no way to talk with her, so I just sat down. After several minutes of sitting together, I pointed to my camera and I was surprised when she nodded, which I interpreted as her consent. I slowly raised my camera and made several photographs. We sat there for another 30 minutes, and of course, neither of us spoke a word. There was something very peaceful about the encounter, as we both realized the only way to communicate was in silence. Yet I could sense that we both enjoyed each other's presence. Finally, I got up to leave, instinctively putting one hand over my heart, and I was surprised when she did the same. When I got back to town, Joe and I exchanged stories about the photographs we had made. It would be weeks before we returned home and had our film developed, so we could only describe our encounters, our images, and our excitement with words. It was the pre-digital era when you waited for what seemed like forever to be surprised.
Mm.
So, in doing this book, I really wanted to tell the stories behind uh, each of these photographs, um, because I felt that was, the only way that I could tell the story of my being a photographer. Um, so I don't know how many of these people want to sit through, or if you have any more questions, Frank, but let me know.
I was letting you speak. Your storytelling is is wonderful and incredibly captivating. Yeah, share a few more with us. The
Well,
lips.
what I'll do is I'll do what I said first, which is I'll try to shorten them from the versions that are in the
Okay.
book. But so this is Motel, and you'll notice down below that on the text page that there's a small caption which describes what it is, when and where it was shot, and that there's a generic caption up top, Motel in this case. And I wanted to do it that way because I just wanted them to be plain things, Sahara, holy, which is the ceremony. Um, so it was humming loudly. Sitting in the dark on the edge of the Mojave Desert, a 10-ton block of concrete seemed to be waiting for aliens to land. As my assistant and I watched, the humming became louder, as if it was the soundtrack from a bad horror film. We stepped back, not because it might explode, but to take it in, to scan every bit of the raw cement structure that confronted us. The transformer had seen better days, and the yellow-green fluorescent phosphors kept sputtering. Large insects with bat-like wings were darting back and forth, and their buzzing was a counterpoint to the humming. We had seen it a mile away, a remnant of post-industrial, post-apocalyptic America. I don't remember where we were. Maybe it was Baker, maybe it was north on 127 past Silver Dry Lake. We stared transfixed at the cinder block washed in acid green and yellow light, and its pulsing red neon nightlight that declared motel. I photographed the sign and wondered if there was a curse that came with making photographs of it. We walked back 100 yards and just stared and laughed. What else could you do but laugh, except perhaps ring the buzzer and pay $10 for the rite of passage and maybe even stay there? We drove on in the desert's warm breeze, leaving motel behind us as it kept humming loudly, playing its lullaby to the bugs. So, I wanted this book to be a retrospective of my work. And I always knew that there were stories, that I wasn't telling about photographing these things. I mean, you'd come back from these shoots and you'd be, to use the generic term, wasted. I mean, you'd be exhausted, I wasn't there to shoot motel. I forget what I was there to do, but you'd come across these things while you're shooting, an ad. Some of these shots came from ads, and you were shooting something fantastic, but you weren't telling the story. It just ended up being in a magazine with a some copy about selling a shirt or something. And I, I, I saw a whole other side to it, which I was trying to tell.
Yeah. So, Eric, are these stories, I mean, from your notes, or this is all from your memory as you started to put together the book?
It's all from memory, and I don't tell something that wasn't really there, but obviously these things affected me.
Yeah.
This is the St. Louis Arch, and as a visual person, as a photographer, this is the first thing I saw because we in the layout, the art director had this guy running against the large arch. It wasn't propped this way, but I just saw it tight like this, and you didn't know it was the St. Louis Arch, and that's what appealed to me. So I don't have a story handy about this one,
It's
but
fine.
I woke up one morning and the art director was out jogging, and I wanted to go out and shoot parts of the arch because I love the light, along the side here. And I saw him running and I stopped him and I said, would you mind running by a few times? Just jog slowly, don't run. And that's how this photograph came about.
Well,
So I'll read another story. Um,
okay.
it was there, and then it wasn't there, belching fire on top of a glacier of snow and ice. My flight to Iceland was delayed due to all the ash being thrown in the troposphere. So the volcano had erupted in Iceland, and a good friend of mine by the name of Seth Resnick, by complete fortune luck, was about to do a workshop in Iceland. I called Seth up and I said, can we leave today? And he said, I can't leave today. I'm working, I'm doing stuff, and we're not due to leave for a month. I said, oh God, this is never going to work out. I mean, I want to go with you. I don't want to go over there now. But I realized that I was going to probably miss shooting the volcano. Well, I had things to do as well, and a month later we went over there. But flights from the US because of all the ash was being thrown in all sorts of directions. And flights from the US, they didn't want ash going, in the troposphere into the engines of the plane for obvious reasons. So I'll read again. My flight to Iceland was delayed due to all the ash being thrown into the troposphere. And I slept on the floor of the departure lounge at JFK, waiting to find out if the flight to Reykjavik would be canceled. A week later, looking up at the night sky, which was lit with the fiery eruption of the volcano at the peak of an icy glacier, everyone in the small group of photographers was speechless. We watched in awe as it belched sparks and tossed car-sized boulders into the air. On that star-filled night, we watched the magic of nature with newfound friends. No IMAX, no artificial intelligence, just a flash of primeval wonder as we witnessed a unique moment when fire shot violently from the top of a crater covered with snow. In the dark cold of night, sipping from a flask of scotch that our guide had brought along, we were a small group, hypnotized by the spectacle of the eruption in front of us. I heard the clicking of camera shutters and then silence. Oohs, ahs, more clicks, more gasps, more roars from the dragon's mouth, and more silence. We looked at each other as if to ask, am I really here seeing this? As night became the next day, the volcano shut down, the eruption stopped, and we knew we had all been changed forever. So these things are like a light switch. They'll be belching fire and ash and boulders, and then all of a sudden something happens, a boulder falls back into the crevasse and it just seals itself up. But part of what I wanted to do was also I wanted to show, visually, but verbally as well, what it's like to be a photographer, not just shooting advertising, but shooting advertising and like I said, portraits and volcanoes, the story of a photographer's life. Because back then, as you know, Frank, you were expected to do everything. You were expected to shoot still lifes, which was fantastic. Now they want the world's greatest still life photographer to shoot the still life. Back then, they wanted someone who didn't know what he was doing to shoot the still life. I mean, they would hire Phil Marco, of course, who was an incredible photographer, but he would do it the standard way, which is 8x10, but he had the perfect drop dripping down the side of the glass, and what they wanted in those days was they wanted someone to come along and do something crazy, like explode the glass in slow motion.
Right. And he could.
The ideas were as important as the technical ability, and it was the idea behind the photograph that they thought they wanted, until you came up with it. But that's what was fantastic back then.
Yeah, no, you're right about the idea. The idea seems to have long been gone. But when you decided to put together the book, you right off the top, it was about telling a story about the images as well.
Right off the top, it was definitely about telling the story, because the original idea was to have a spread, and there'd be the in this case the volcano on the right side and the story on the left side. And then as it evolved, of course, you wanted to show a few other photographs. So this is looking right into the crevasse, and we walked up. We had a guide, and we walked up the side of the volcano. But this particular shot was done from a plane, small plane.
Right. Oh, beautiful.
And then what happened was, I don't want to dwell on this one too much, but everyone left, and a few of us stayed behind, and we were in a completely different part of Iceland. And one day we happened to come across this scene of, it was late in the evening, and the sunlight was hitting the ash coming out of the, I don't think anyone else, got this photograph, but it was just incredible.
Mm.
Yeah.
It
So,
is.
you it all worked out in the end. I guess I wish we had been able to get there sooner, but telling these stories was important to me because it wasn't just telling the stories about the photographs, it was telling the stories about an era of photography,
Mm.
like this golden era where you were expected, and I know you remember this, Frank, you were expected to shoot still lifes. You were expected to, not everyone, but I mean, Phil Marco shot still lifes, period, I think. Um, but they wanted, the idea was what was important to art directors in those days. They had to come up with ideas themselves, but they didn't always want to go to the person who was going to shoot with an 8x10 camera, so they wanted to experiment. So they wanted someone who would shoot 8 by
Embrace it.
10 or 35, or come up with a crazy idea. And that's why, I refer to it as the golden age, because you won't have that opportunity anymore. It's every once in a while, it comes around where someone's willing to take the risk, but those were the days of risk taking.
It's quite a journey from Syracuse, huh, Pete?
Quite a journey from Syracuse,
Right? I mean,
And
that's something else. So, good question. When are you the happiest behind the camera?
you mean in terms of the subject matter?
Yeah, I guess the subject matter, the timing, the location, or when the magic
Probably
happens.
probably now.
Yeah.
Not because there's not an art director, but because I'm shooting things and discovering things and thinking about things that I never thought about before. And you know, it's a golden era for me where I'm shooting things that I probably didn't see before.
Mm.
It's only in hindsight, with all of this experience, that um, you see these things. So,
And
you know, I'm looking at the time here. Oh my God. I'm gonna,
let me ask you, what do you do
sure.
now to challenge yourself, Eric?
Well, what I do to challenge myself is what I have always done, which is to give myself assignments. The photographing Bruce, um, the only reason that happened was because I sensed at that time, and this is the story I didn't tell. I sensed at that time that he was different, and that he was going to have a long career, and that he was, going to change things and be something that several generations of people grew up with. So I gave myself the assignment, in essence, to photograph Bruce Springsteen. I was not assigned by Columbia to do that. No one assigned me, and my career was beginning to blossom, so to speak. And I really wanted to photograph him, and the only way that I knew at the time to do that was just in effect to hang out with him. And I lost a number of assignments. It was early in my career. I just took time off to do it.
So, I mean, so you actually tracked like where he was performing, going to Jersey? I
Oh
mean, like,
yeah, I must have gone to well over 100 concerts, like in the year before I did the album cover.
oh
Um,
wow.
so I had all my gear stolen at one of the venues. Like 3 cameras, 6, 7 lenses. Um, you go with the flow, and it's something I really wanted to do. And I think that's, if I was going to give people a lesson, give friends or assistants a lesson, I would just say, go with your gut. There's something in you that's telling you to go photograph this, and it must be important. And the opportunities don't come up very often. So there's this Latin phrase, carpe diem, seize the day, and,
Mm.
and that's sort of my motto. I don't follow it enough myself, but getting out and shooting for yourself is the most important thing you can do, because there's the assignment work, and then there's the work that you do for yourself. And fortunately, sometimes the two things will merge, you know.
Yeah. The last photograph in the book is a color abstract.
Yeah.
Um, can you speak about that? Karen Hirsch put that in the chat room.
Well, I did when we started.
Oh, that was that shot. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I could, unfortunately, I,
Yeah. Can you
um,
speak a little bit about the lips shot?
sure.
That's my favorite. One of my
uh,
favorite. And the Coca-Cola, yeah.
I'll skip ahead here. I want to talk about this one because it's fun, but let me get to the lips. Where are the lips? We're gonna have trouble if we go back
There you
and
go. No,
forth.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, yeah. So let me. So this was shot in the studio, and the ad agency. Again, I'll come back to this thing of, in those days you were asked to do everything, and that was fantastic, because if you were asked to shoot a cosmetics ad these days, and all you did was landscapes, I don't know, maybe come up with something fantastic. But um, that was what I loved about that period of time, is that people were willing to hire someone who had never photographed a cosmetics ad before to shoot a cosmetics ad. It was all new to me, so to speak. And it wasn't like they wanted you to prove yourself, or you were out to prove yourself, but they believed in something it was that you were doing visually, enough to hire you to do it. So I'll read you the story behind this one. I'm not used to talking this long, but hold on a second. Open up the door, or we'll break it down. I'll never forget the loud, commanding thud on the studio door as the New York City fireman barked out his order for compliance. I opened the door. Like many of the surreal adventures in my studio, this shoot began with my assistants and I shooting dozens of Polaroids. We photographed more than 200 pairs of lips as we looked for perfection. The cosmetics company wanted to showcase their lipsticks by photographing the model underwater. After a long, serious discussion at the agency about the potential for the model to drown, I convinced them to let me photograph her above the surface. So the original concept, and I only remember this, somewhat somewhat vaguely, but they wanted her. They thought she'd be somehow, they'd convinced the client that the model would be underwater, holding her breath. Um, it was crazy. So I convinced them not to do that. I had a large tank made of clear, thick plexiglass, measured about 4 feet by 8 feet, and it was 3 feet deep. And as I watched it being glued together, so this is plexiglass, and they're using this clear liquid that looks like water. And as soon as they stick the two pieces of plexiglass together, it melts the plastic, and you could hit it with a hammer. The workmen assured me it would hold under the pressure of more than 750 gallons of water. Yes, we did our homework, but it still terrified us. The key to this image for me is the light. I used a deep blue gel for the main light and a spotlight on the model's lips. As I adjusted the spot and watched the light reflecting off the water's surface, an assistant nudged me and we casually stood back to look at the tank, which was bulging significantly. We had raised the strobes off the floor and wrapped them in plastic bags, but it looked as though at any moment the tank was going to burst, drenching the high voltage flash units on the floor in a torrent of water. Fortunately, the tank held, but none of us had thought about how to drain it, the firemen. We ran a large hose out a front window, and for more than an hour, water rained down on Fifth Avenue. Someone who was walking by called in a fire, thinking that sprinklers had gone off on a floor above. The client loved the photograph, and it became part of the lore and mythology of my career, although it could have ended it. Yeah,
Mm.
those days were crazy, but you
Yeah.
did, and then the next day there was something even crazier,
Well, I have to say, I said this to you in Dubai. That photograph was hanging in every art director's office in New
Yeah,
York City. You use
yeah,
that for promotion, and it was just everywhere.
yeah.
There was no image that was more seen in the ad agencies than that one. So let me ask you two questions. What's your favorite photograph, and what was your most difficult photo shoot?
Well, this one ranks up there. The most difficult photo shoot I did was one of the longer ones. It was for Johnny Walker Scotch. We shot it out in California, and to start with, we had. I'm answering these backwards. To start with, we had 30 days of rain. Um,
Wow.
and we were out there in January. And in fact, that shoot, well, it was funny because we finally, I convinced them, look, we've got to shoot something, and we would get a little dry spell and we'd run out there and we'd shoot something. But it won awards, and it's just one of those things when you're doing advertising, you've got to make it work, and somehow we did. But it was a great crew, a lot of fun, and they expected. I think they had budgeted. You're gonna love this. I think they had budgeted for a week, and I think it took us, upwards of 5 or 6 weeks to do the shoot. My favorite shoot changes from time to time, and like this shot of the lips was one of my favorite shots because it's so exotic. Um, and it was hard to get that light just right, but I've got a lot of them. I've got a lot of them.
Beautiful. Oh. So finish us off, Eric, with words of wisdom, because I can't tell you how enjoyable it is to listen to the stories and
Well,
all of it.
one I taught my I went to Syracuse University, and the Newhouse School of Journalism is there, and I go back every once in a while to talk to the kids, and you know photography's changed a lot. I mean, now we have artificial intelligence where you can be an art director and describe what it is you want, and magically it'll appear on the screen. Things have changed a lot, and it's it's hard to give words of wisdom when you're up against that kind of wall. I would just say, number one, it's important to shoot for yourself, because first of all, you go crazy if all you do is shoot for clients, and you learn as much, if not more, shooting for yourself, and it's the shooting for yourself that generates those photographs that stick in people's minds where they're not looking at an ad and they say, wow, I remember that shot, the Coca-Cola kid, walking by the Coca-Cola sign, the sign. So that, that's pretty much my words of wisdom are shoot for yourself. And the other thing is, as I said earlier, seize the day, that carpe diem. It's important to realize that if you are going to do advertising, if whatever you do, whether it's advertising, whether it's personal work, if you're going to stand out, you've got to be true to yourself. You've got to shoot the things that you feel like shooting. And so there's no problem with not doing advertising. It's if what you want to do is to shoot landscapes, then you'll shoot landscapes. And one way or another, if you're good enough, um, that work will be seen and purchased and form a basis for you to make a living.
And what's on the horizon for you, Eric? What's the next project? What's the next
Well,
challenge?
I keep trying to convince myself that I want to do a black and white book. So we'll see.
Okay.
I have this idea of the Robert Frank title, The Americans.
Yeah.
And except my title would be Los Americanos, and so it would be the immigrants. I want to do a black and white series of portraits of immigrants.
And do you come up with that because that's a challenge for you creatively?
No, well, it's a challenge, obviously, in many ways. I mean, if you look at the series of portraits that Richard Avedon did, I don't know if I would do it that way, if I do it differently, but there's a lot of ideas that occur to me, and because my work is primarily color, I would like to do a black and white project. I think I like the challenge of doing that. I think doing something about America is important to me, I mean, immigrants are the story of our day,
Yeah. 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 Well,
Is
if
anyone
anyone else,
asking any questions?
yeah, we could open it up. If anyone has a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat room, and I'll get it to Eric. So yeah, now would be your time if you have but
Well,
Durrell,
I'm not seeing the people who are on here. How do I do the participants? I see it.
yeah.
Got it.
Durrell mentioned something which is really nice, but how you mentioned John Berg and you mentioned so many other people, that played such an important role for you. Like I said that earlier, I really admire that to give credit to everybody on your journey. That's a lot of people don't do that, and you do that, almost as a matter of course, which is really wonderful.
Well, the reality is that you often don't do that. I mean, I've stayed in touch with a lot of the people who assisted me, and you go through. It's not all glory. There's a lot of stressful times, deadlines, and things like that. I had some incredible people work with me and for me, and every once in a while we get together, but they're important,
Yeah.
and that's why you bring them up, because sometimes they come up with the idea, and you get the credit. So,
Yeah.
and it's important to keep up those friendships and see them come up with their own ideas and become successful.
Yeah, here's a question. Did you ever shoot Bruce later on in his career?
Oh yeah, but not, he's he's going on 55, 60-year career at this point. I shot him primarily in the 70s. I shot him into the mid 80s, and we've stayed in touch for a number of reasons. Joanna and I saw him back in February. But I haven't photographed him recently. Next year's the 50th anniversary of Born to Run, and I keep telling myself I want to photograph him again. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So, any other questions? But Eric, and thank you for giving us, so much time. I really do
You're
appreciate it.
welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean,
A lot of
and
fun.
when the black and white book is done, you have to showcase it, here,
Okay.
and because I'm sure that that's going to be a great time. Yeah, if you go through the chat room, you'll see a lot of beautiful comments and wonderful sentiment about what you do and how you do it, and for sharing so much with us. It's really a gift. So I thank you very, very
It's
much
a
for
lot of
doing it.
fun. Thank you. Thank everyone for listening.
Yeah,
Good.
and you can get Eric's book, on Amazon. Just make sure you put in the full title. That's the most most important thing.
Yeah.
And we will be, we'll be.
We'll do this again.
Yes, we will, and we have other. There's the link right there in the chat room for the book. It's
And if you
yeah,
want to know how to do this, the mortising of a
yes,
person is just send me an email.
yes. If you
Quick
want to know
name at my
how
entire name.com.
yeah, if you want to know how Eric set it up so he could be in the position he is on the screen, he will share that secret with you. Um, so Martha McGuire says hello, and
Hi, John. Hi, Martha.
yeah, and
Looking forward to your book. It'll be
yeah.
out in another week or 10 days, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So, thanks, Eric, and we will tell everyone, just so everyone knows, in 2 weeks we have Eugene Richards who's going to be presenting. So, yeah, that should be another nice presentation. But this was really just wonderful, and I appreciate it.